Buddha's death. Why Ken's wrong. Buddha's death gives Ken Wheeler the chance to concoct another conspiracy theory. Find out what he imagined out of thin air and why it's poor history and even worse doctrine. According to scripture, Buddha died after a 45-year career as an itinerant teacher at age 80. His health had been failing for some time, with sudden intense stomach pains that nearly killed him on an earlier occasion. Buddha visited the home of Kunda the blacksmith, who served a meal of sukara madava, tender pork. While eating, Buddha became gravely ill from abdominal pain and intestinal bleeding. The Buddha was gracious. He was more concerned that Kunda would blame himself than about his own condition. He gave his right-hand man Ananda a message for Kunda. "It is a gain to you, friend Kunda, a blessing that the Tathagata, the Buddha, took his last alms meal from you and then came to his end." Buddha passed away promptly and peacefully, surrounded by his monks. As end-of-life stories go, this one is pretty uneventful. Ken Wheeler seems to be obsessed with the circumstances surrounding the Buddha's passing. Since the Buddha died about 2,500 years ago, this may seem odd, but the angry photographer has very clear motives to raise this issue. Kentucky Ken needs to explain why Buddhist scripture and traditional teachings contradict his notions about metaphysics, the soul, and immortality. Of course, he could just accept that his beliefs aren't consistent with original Buddhist doctrine. The contradiction irritates Ken Wheeler, so instead of accepting it, he claims the Buddha taught his monks precisely what the YouTuber tries to argue. To justify his claims about the immortal soul, Ken Wheeler invents a conspiracy theory concerning the Buddha's passing. According to the angry photographer, Kunda deliberately poisoned the Buddha as part of a murder plot among the monks. Their motive, according to the Theoria Apophasis host, was to take control of the early Buddhist movement. That enabled them to change Buddhist teaching from something conforming to Ken Wheeler's peculiar views to what we recognize as Buddhism today. As usual with ancient texts, the angry photographer pulls off this sleight of hand through mistranslation and cherry-picking. Kunda the blacksmith, Kamaraputta, now becomes Kunda, son of the evil one. The Theoria Apophasis creator does something even more fanciful in translating the word for the entree of the Buddha's last meal. Tender pork, sukara madava, now becomes pig's demise, a poisonous plant that Ken Wheeler imagines out of whole cloth. Kentucky Ken, who apparently has never raised any pigs, claims that pigs will eat anything, even deadly poison. Pigs are omnivores, but they're quite intelligent and finicky about which plants they'll consume. Even so, according to the angry photographer, his imaginary plant was a toxic threat to the local hogs. Even if there was such a plant, there isn't. Why would Kunda feed his guiding light pig poison? The YouTuber behind Theoria Apophasis concocts the notion that he fell under the evil influence of a monk named Kashyapa. Readers may not recognize the name Kashyapa, but they've probably heard this sutra about him. In the famous story of the flower sermon, rather than saying anything, the Buddha simply held up a beautiful flower in his hand. Kashyapa was the first monk to get the message that words can't express everything. Because of that, Buddha informally looked to Kashyapa as his successor. Shortly after Buddha's death, Kashyapa chaired a meeting along with Buddha's trusty aide Ananda to agree on what Buddhism should teach going forward. Ken Wheeler believes that Kashyapa seized this opportunity to change Buddhist teachings to conform to his own nefarious agenda. Long story short, according to the angry photographer, Kashyapa convinced Kunda to feed poisoned pig mushrooms to the Buddha. That way, Kashyapa could compose and preach a twisted version of Buddhism. The Buddha was 80 and having near fatal attacks of dysentery. So why bother? At that point, the murderers could have simply bided their time. Besides, why would Buddha's long-suffering assistant Ananda tolerate Kashyapa perverting teachings that Ananda had studiously memorized? And why would Ananda take part in such a corrupt meeting? The angry photographer appears to be confusing, deliberately perhaps, Kashyapa with Devadatta. Devadatta thought he should take over the Buddha's movement, but Buddha rejected him. According to legend, this rival monk then made 3 unsuccessful attempts on the Buddha's life. The first involved hired assassins. The assassins refused to carry out the murder, which makes one wonder why Kunda would go through with a similar plan. Devadatta also tried to drop a boulder on the Buddha, but missed. In another plot, Devadatta reportedly unleashed a drugged elephant on the Buddha, which caused no harm. These legends make Devadatta seem like an ancient version of Wile E. Coyote. Devadatta died before the Buddha. This inconvenient fact seems to have led Ken Wheeler to shoehorn the Devadatta plot into the Buddha's death story. Again, one has to feel sorry for Ken Wheeler. He's written a lengthy, verbose, and convoluted treatise on this topic. Imagine all the useful things he might have accomplished instead. Nothing in Ken Wheeler's conspiracy theory makes any sense, and things that don't make sense aren't true. The angry photographer's treacherous tale of intrigue may make good clickbait, but it's very poor history and even worse doctrine. On the other hand, it's good for a laugh.